Chapter 19. All night the waves grew bigger. The motion of the boat became rougher. The crew went out on deck and secured everything they could. Tony stayed with the captain in the wheelhouse, watching angry green waves wash over the bow. Nicholas and Edward huddled together under the table. The trawler rumbled along. It climbed up the back of the great waves. The boat paused briefly and then slid down the front until the bow plowed into the next wave. Huge sheets of spray flew out from each side of the boat. The boat struggled up the next wave, repeating the wild ride. The rolling motion threw everything loose onto the deck. Empty pots, dishes, forks, and spoons slid around where Nicholas and Edward lay. It all skidded back and forth in a tangled, wet mess. The two animals were about as miserable as they could be. Nicholas watched water pool on the deck. It covered more and more space as time went by. "I can't believe what's happening. Everything seemed just fine a few hours ago. Now it's all just one big soggy heap," Edward said. He shook his head in disbelief. "This reminds me of the flood back home," Nicholas said. "Does it look like the water is rising in here?" "I believe it is. What happens if it keeps going up? Will we sink?" The water level continued to rise. Nicholas and Edward scrambled up to the tabletop. They slid around on the slick surface. "Nicholas, I think you better get Tony down here. He can call for help. We are definitely sinking." Nicholas fought off his fear and leapt for a mug floating by. He paddled his way to the stairs. The stairs led to the wheelhouse. He could see the captain standing at the wheel, trying to keep the boat on course. Tony lay curled up in the captain's bunk. Nicholas squeaked loudly so that Tony could hear him over the storm. Tony lifted his head and looked down at Nicholas. "Nicholas, what are you doing up here? It's not safe for you to be moving about in this storm." "You've got to come with me, Tony. The boat is filling up with water. I think we're sinking," Nicholas said. Tony jumped from the bunk and followed Nicholas down below. "I think we can turn on the pumps, but I will need your help. There is a switch on the wall that is too high for me to reach," Tony said. "Nicholas, you and Edward climb on my back." The two wet animals clung to Tony as he swam through the water over to the wall. "Do you see that red button up there?" he asked Nicholas. "That will turn the pump on and get rid of the water in the boat." Tony stretched up as high as he could. Edward scurried up and stood on the puppy's head. Nicholas followed and stood on Edward's shoulders. He could just reach the switch. With all his might, he pushed on the red button. They heard a whirring sound that meant the pump had started. Slowly the water began to recede. Nicholas and Edward watched the cabin dry out. The captain came below and saw the mess. He picked up Tony and wrapped him in a towel. "There you are, you little rascal! I let one of the crew steer the boat when I noticed you were gone from the wheelhouse." Tony licked the captain's face. "Looks like we have a lot of cleaning up to do in here," the captain said. "But I think the storm is winding down." Nicholas and Edward watched from the back of the shelf. They were glad the storm was passing. They wanted to get back to dry land and get off the boat. By morning, the storm was over. The trawler was making its way toward Boston Harbor. They passed a lighthouse on Little Brewster Island. "That's the oldest lighthouse in America," Tony said. Nicholas and Edward were looking out the galley window at the sights. "Soon the city of Boston will come into view," Tony said. "We're headed for the fish pier. Boston is such a big city, you're sure to find someone there who will help you get to West Tisbury." Nicholas watched the buildings grow larger as they approached the city. Even Edward was quiet, trying to take in all the sights. Big jet airplanes landed at the airport nearby. Small boats and big ships went about their business in the harbor. The trawler slowed and landed with a gentle bump at the pier. They had arrived in the state capital. Neither Nicholas nor Edward knew where to turn next. They looked out at the hustle and bustle of the city and realized their adventure was about to change.